The Unmarked by Matt Fleagle. Chapter 28. The Dellbloods Stand. "Is this the best the Dellbloods can do?" laughed Verlisden. "A wood splitter with a worn axe. I would have expected my daughter at least to stand by your side in this lopsided fight you're picking." Kaleb took a deep breath and looked past Verlisden. Some 40 yards behind her was a line of black-clad scouts holding finely crafted swords at the ready. They stretched 24 yards in both directions and stood at least 5 men deep in their ranks. Verlisden feigned a yawn and twirled her enchanted sword in wide, elaborate strokes as though she were warming up for battle. "Listen to me, Verlisden," Kaleb said. "I, too, have a company of warriors at my heels. They are prepared to fight, if necessary. But first, I hope I can reason with you." Verlisden guffawed, her broad, armored shoulders rattling with laughter. "You have warriors." The scouts beside her did not join in her laughter. Kaleb wondered if he might divide the scouts' loyalties from their commander, to perhaps draw some of them over to his side before any violence was done by Verlisden. "Young man," Verlisden said, once her laughter had died off, "you know nothing about battle, nor do your people, and I am certain you know even less about diplomacy. It is only by my keen foresight that these stone-renders know anything about matters of state. It is why you stand no chance against my forces." "I'm not looking to sign a treaty, Verlisden. I am here only to say that the old ways are collapsing. The myths about our peoples have been exposed as frauds. They have been undone by the forest spirit." Verlisden's face darkened a bit. Frowning, she said, "Again, log splitter, I question what you know of ancient myths. You've spent your life nursing splintered hands. I've spent mine poring over every last scroll that chronicles our people's histories. Your knowledge of ancient things pales next to my wisdom about magic, the histories, and sacred objects." Kaleb sighed. "You are right when you say that I know little about your people. Indeed, I barely understand my own people's traditions. But none of that matters anymore. What matters now is the sacred tree has fallen, and the Dellbloods no longer bear its mark on their foreheads. You must face the truth. The rules that overshadowed us for years and years have vanished." "Rules instituted by the forest spirit do not just vanish, you pathetic fool," Verlisden snapped back at him. The mirth in her voice had dried up. "The ancient traditions forged in magic are either honored or rejected. There is no other answer to these laws. Those who scorn them, like you, have nothing to look forward to but a swift death at the tip of my sword." "You yourself know this is a lie," pushed Kaleb. "Your own conduct disproves it. Glista told me all about you, that you tossed over the traditions of your elders in order to build a private army. You seized more power in Ableron than is rightfully allowed to one person." "Silence," she hissed at him, casting a sideways glance at the scouts beside her. "I have heard enough. You have a simple choice before you, Kaleb of the Dellbloods. Either yield to us and pay the tribute your elders negotiated with me, or these scouts will fall upon your troops, then upon your city. It will fall swiftly, and I promise we spare no one who stands in our way." Kaleb turned and whistled through his teeth in the direction of the woods behind him. A few seconds later, Glista appeared from within the shaded foliage, followed closely by her ragtag band of Dellblood fighters. Their small party walked in clumsy, unsynchronized steps, turning their hands nervously around the crudely fashioned spears in their grips. Finally, they stood just behind Kaleb, opposite the perfect line of scouts facing them from the other side of the meadow. Next to Glista were the 6 girls who had volunteered to fight. This time, the scouts of Ableron echoed Verlisden's laughter. Amusement danced in her eyes as she looked first at Glista, then back at Kaleb. "My dear, you cannot be serious," she purred. These are the Dellbloods' best imitation of my scouts. Little girls with sticks and farmers still wearing their sweaty tunics. They are brave, and they are good people, Kaleb said without flinching. They are pathetic, just like you, Verlisden said. She turned to Glista. So, you are content to die with this riffraff today? I am, Glista said quietly. But not only for their sakes. I hope to tear my people out of your cruel clutches. Your people, Verlisden scoffed. Suddenly Kaleb remembered something. Oh, yes, he stammered. I forgot. Verlisden, your daughter is going to get a taste of your blade, or else you will dine with her sword. His voice trailed off. Verlisden and Glista both glared at him. It's all right, Kaleb, Glista said, clearing her throat. I've got the insults covered from here on out. We're wasting time, Verlisden said. Then she announced loud enough for the entire company of Dellbloods to hear. All of you with the little spears, listen to me. This is your last chance to walk out of this meadow alive. Join me and my scouts now, or in a few moments your blood will water this ground on which you stand. Kaleb looked back at them. None of the Dellbloods budged an inch, though a few of the men exchanged fearful looks with the fighter next to him. Very well, Verlisden said more gravely. She lifted her sword high above her. Scouts, without hesitation or mercy, fall upon these foes. Her loud command caught Kaleb off guard. Immediately the scouts dashed forward, their sharp swords extended. The tips of their blades shot blinding light of the reflected sun into the Dellbloods' eyes. Fear momentarily seized Kaleb, but he soon forgot his fears, for one of the scouts had swung his blade at him already. Lifting his axe as a fearful reflex, he barely managed to repel the scout's first blow. The blade's contact with the axe handle jolted the scout backwards. The scout looked puzzled as he regained his footing. He squinted at Kaleb's weapon and saw that he had not even dented the wooden skin of the axe handle. Kaleb's courage was kindled. He sprung forward and knocked the fearful scout to the ground with a blow from his axe, one that the scout threw up his sword to deflect just in time. With his opponent down, Kaleb cast a quick glance at his allies in the meadow. Glista had rushed directly against her mother and was engaged in a fierce contest with her mother's enchanted blade. The rest of the Dellbloods were holding their own, but only by token of the invincible spears they held. They had forgotten Glista's training and were waving the spears wildly. When they made contact with the scouts' swords, they were able to resist every parry and even push back their foes a few steps. Their valiant effort moved Kaleb, but a chill of uncertainty swept through his bones. When the scouts discovered the Dellbloods' secret, that they were fighting with enchanted weapons, the Stonerunners would adjust their tactics. Soon they would aim to dislodge the magical spears from their opponents' hands. And when that happened, the battle would come to a swift end, with each of the Dellblood fighters lying dead at a scout's feet. Kaleb raced over to help one of the smallest girls at his side. She had withstood at least 5 blows from a short scout, but seemed to be growing winded. Just then she tripped over an uneven patch of earth that jutted up beneath her feet and fell to the ground. The scout pounced on her, preparing to plunge his sword through her flesh. Kaleb intercepted the scout's sword just in time. With the edge of his axe head locked against the sword, Kaleb pulled him a few steps away from the defenseless victim. Then Kaleb shouted as he untangled his axe and swung it rapidly at the scout's sword. The small scout deflected the axe with uncommon strength and reared back to strike at Kaleb before he could swing the axe again. Time began to crawl in Kaleb's head. Pounding in his ears were muffled screams of men and women all around him, the cries of Dellbloods outmatched by their foes. He couldn't afford to look around, but he knew in his gut that their forces were losing. The scouts were too plentiful, the Dellbloods' magical advantage too limited to score them a victory over well-trained opponents. Verlisden had been right. It was only a matter of time, perhaps minutes, before Glista, Kaleb, and even the little girls fighting alongside them met a bloody end in this meadow swarming with Stonerender scouts. Hot sweat ran into Kaleb's eyes and down upon the short stubble of his face. Blinking the sweat away, he gazed into the desperate black eyes of his enemy. Just then, however, the scout's eyes widened at something behind Kaleb. Kaleb didn't dare follow his opponent's eyes for fear that the Stonerender might be feigning interest in something to trick Kaleb into turning his back on an enemy in the heat of combat. But the scout's fear was genuine. The Stonerender gasped and leapt back from Kaleb's axe, shielding his eyes with his gloved hand. The man was squinting at the eastern edge of the clearing. Kaleb now heard it. 100 footfalls whipping through the high grasses somewhere behind him. He swiveled while maintaining a defensive stance to see what had so alarmed the scout on the horizon. Just beyond, and slightly to the east, what looked like a herd of small gray bodies were rushing toward the scene of the battle. A few moments later, Kaleb realized what the gray things were. It was the pack of coyotes from Terrashine, led by Grimwit, who bounded ahead of them fleet-footed. He opened his mouth and let out a roar. The pack of small coyotes began howling with him as they charged forward. Kaleb nearly jumped out of his skin when an ear-piercing howl from Teva, who had just pinned down a Stonerender 10 yards from where Kaleb stood, answered their baying in the distance. He had never heard Teva's howl. For a graceful creature, she commanded a terrifying voice. It made Kaleb shiver in spite of himself. One of the scouts off to Kaleb's left hollered, "What are those?" to another Stonerender. "I don't know. And is that a bear?" answered the other scout. Just then, Kaleb looked up to see something massive rising from behind the tree line of Glenwood's woods. It rose on saffron wings, flapping in the afternoon breeze and scattering the glint of the sun in all directions. With a loud screech, Leek, now a dragon again, pulled his wings in tight against his lithe body and drifted over the coyotes and Grimwit to provide aerial cover for his fellow beasts. Kaleb's heart swelled and his eyes watered. He let out an involuntary cry. "This way, friends," he shouted. "Join us in our battle. We will restore order to Parison." Turning again to the enemy, Kaleb watched at least a dozen bewildered scouts, some who were only moments away from chasing down a disarmed Dellblood fighter, drop their swords. They sprinted westward in frenzied retreat. The braver scouts who remained braced themselves against coyote teeth. They swung their swords in low arcs to engage the beasts at their feet. But they had no training to rely upon in this skirmish against small animals. By sheer numbers, the remaining regiment of Stonerender scouts still outnumbered their Dellblood counterparts, and the forces from Terrashine. However, the dragon took on nearly a dozen of them at once. With his sharp talons and broad sweeps of his powerful tail, he frustrated and dispatched the scouts assailing him. Moreover, the coyotes, though much smaller than Teva, were just as nimble as she. At Teva's direction, they concentrated their efforts on tripping up the scouts. Nipping at ankles and knees, they threw the Stonerenders into confusion. This gave the Dellblood fighters opportunities to regather and fall upon the scouts with the very spears the coyotes had sharpened for them. Within a few minutes, the momentum of the conflict began to turn, as one by one, Verlisden's scouts either fell under the claws, spears, tails, or talons of Kaleb's swelling forces. Many more fled screaming into the woods at the western edge of the clearing. Kaleb circled the battlefield on tired feet, his arm throbbing with exhaustion. With relief, he noticed that the last few scouts, those who had survived the battle or refused to flee, were beginning to surrender to their foes. A smile crossed his face when he discovered that many of the Dellblood fighters were now holding spears in one hand and Stonerender weapons that had been dropped behind in their opposite hand. But about this time, another sound drew his attention. It was Verlisden's scream, growing ever louder amid the hectic fray of battle. Eventually, the vicious curses of the Stonerender's queen rose above the clanging of swords and growling of beasts in the meadow. Kaleb caught glimpses of his wearied comrade getting cuffed repeatedly with the bewitched weapon her mother wielded. The inexorable Verlisden dropped near-fatal stroke after near-fatal stroke upon Glista with the enchanted blade. At one point, Verlisden's sword split her daughter's clothing at the calf and drew blood from her leg. At another pivotal moment in their melee, the towering fiend bruised her daughter's shoulder. But Glista scampered to her feet each time the enchanted sword sent her sprawling. She swung back at her mother's invincible blade with an almost inhuman ferocity. Nevertheless, Verlisden seemed somehow stronger, even more resilient with each blow her daughter landed on her with the ordinary sword. Nearly all of Verlisden's forces had surrendered or disappeared, but their leader fought on, hacking and screaming at her weary daughter. She seemed oblivious to the specter of defeat. Soon, a loose circle of Dellbloods and coyotes began to form around Glista and Verlisden. Even Leek alighted 20 yards from the scuffle, when the last of the scouts had been routed or apprehended with the dragon's help. Kaleb secured the 20 or so captured scouts who had not fled the battle, posting uninjured Dellblood fighters to guard them. Then he ran to join the growing crowd surrounding Glista. Glista was in trouble. Grimwit hunkered down as though about to spring at Verlisden. "Step aside, Glista," the beast roared. But Glista waved him off, invoking once again the Stonerender code. Warriors, she explained through pants, could only preserve their sacred honor by settling matters with a sworn opponent on their own. But Kaleb, pushing up to the front of the circle, disregarded Glista's request. "Verlisden, end this at once," he said. "Your scouts have surrendered. You are fighting alone." "Fool," she screamed back at him between short breaths. "My reign will not. It cannot come to an end. Don't you see? I still have a piece of your sacred tree in my hands. None of you, not these beasts, not the Dellbloods, not even my daughter, can withstand my blade." Her voice sounded half-crazed, as though the magic in her weapon had mingled with the implacable hatred in her heart. The result had poisoned her wits and blinded her to the reality stacked up against her. Kaleb could stand by no longer. Rushing into the middle of the fracas, he interjected his axe between the two flashing blades. Glista fell backward when her sword collided with Kaleb's axe handle. She lay panting and dazed on the grass. Verlisden's sword bounced off Kaleb's weapon as though she were holding a hollowed-out stick. "Your axe! What is it made of?" she hissed. "It was given to me by someone much older and wiser than you." "Who?" demanded Verlisden as she took a careful step away from Kaleb. "A prophet. He is the warden of all these creatures gathered here. It was he who first taught me that there is power, that there is magic, greater than the magic bound up in sacred objects. This power cannot be stolen from a sacred tree or warped into a violent weapon, as you have tried to do. It can only be bestowed by the good graces of the forest spirit." Glista had climbed unsteadily back to her feet, her arms and legs quivering with exhaustion. "Kaleb, let me fight her. Her life must end today," she said. "Look around, Glista," said Kaleb gently. He motioned toward the panting coyotes and the filthy Dellblood fighters encircling Glista on the battlefield. "You have done more than enough, Glista. We have won. It is time to rest from war." "You do not understand, Kaleb," Glista retorted, tears and sweat coursing down her pale cheeks. "I must bring her down. She drove me out of our land. She turned my friends and comrades against me. She left me to fend for myself against my very people." At this, Glista swooned and dropped to her knees, her blade sliding across the grass as she fell, just barely staying in her grip. Kaleb knelt down with her and cradled her fatigued body under his powerful arms. Grimwit kept a wary eye upon Verlisden, who stood silent with her weapon partially lowered. She was looking around, hopelessly sizing up her odds against the foes assembled. "You are not alone anymore," said Kaleb to Glista. He reached out and clasped her forearm with his strong hand. Then he lifted her back to her feet. "None of us need to feel alone," he said, addressing the crowd of onlookers, "or cast out. That is not how the Forest Spirit intended us to live. Before the division and the superstitions, we enjoyed peace with each other. And now, with the Forest Spirit's help, I hope to do everything I can to restore that peace." Glista looked up at her mother once more. As she did, the expression on Glista's face softened. She nodded to Kaleb. Then she slid her sword back into its sheath behind her back. Teva came to Glista's side, letting her black fur brush against the young woman's bruised arm. Glista smiled down at her and laid her shaking hand upon Teva's head. "Now, for Liston," Kaleb said, turning again to face the towering woman. "We need to discuss the terms of your surrender." "I will not surrender," Verliston said, her voice full of sand and grit. "Your scouts have fled. You have no allies here, or I imagine back in Ablerin. For the stories of your treachery and defeat will soon be spread by the defectors returning there as we speak." Verliston seethed in quiet frustration, but she pursed her lips and said nothing. "So, I'm offering you a choice, Verliston," he went on. "You can leave that savage weapon on the grass here and disappear from Parison forever. If any Dellblood, Stonerender, or a creature of Terrashine sees your face in these territories again, your life will end without a plea. If you cannot agree to these terms, your life ends here and now." "I will do it," growled Grimwit. "Let's hope it's not necessary, Grimwit," Kaleb said, holding up his hand to still the bear. "Those are my terms, Queen. They are a bit crude and unsophisticated, but, as you yourself said, I know little about diplomacy." Verliston gazed at several of the creatures and humans in turn. An impotent rage roiled in her cold face for several moments. Finally, she said, "I will agree to your terms, but on one condition." "What is that?" She sighed deeply. Then she carefully revolved the magic weapon in her hand and extended it toward Glista, handle forward, in what appeared to be a peaceful gesture. "I want my daughter to have this sword." The Dellbloods and animals murmured in low voices at this offer. "Perhaps," Verliston said flatly, "this trinket will remind her that her mother still feels some regret for the way she once used her daughter." Glista said nothing for a moment. When she did not protest, the statuesque woman in her regal battle cape strode meekly forward, taking slow steps toward her daughter. Kaleb lifted his axe as a precaution, but Verliston's lowered head and drooping shoulders convinced him her contrition was genuine. When Verliston and Glista were standing face to face, the mother bowed her head and said, in a weak voice, "Please accept this, my child, a token of my sincerest apology." Glista searched her cruel mother's eyes for signs of deception. Then she reached out her hand and laid it on the hilt of the enchanted sword. For a moment, the two of them were touching, their fingers gracing each other's flesh and the smooth bark of the branch severed from the Dellblood sacred tree. Just then, Teva, still standing beside Glista, shouted, "Glista, her other hand!" Teva had noticed a subtle movement under Verliston's cape as the Stonerender deftly slid her free hand in a reach for something strapped to her back. Glista recoiled from her mother just as Verliston thrust a dagger at Glista's waist. The dagger pierced Glista's abdomen, but missed its target, for Glista had stepped sideways just in time to avoid a thrust of the weapon into her belly and up to her heart. Barely a scream escaped Verliston's lips before she breathed her last breath. In the instant that Verliston had moved to strike her daughter, Teva had lunged at the traitor, knocking her backwards to the ground and simultaneously driving the enchanted blade pointed at Verliston through her chest plate and out of her back on the other side. The wound killed her instantly. Teva stared into the dead face of the Stonerender's former commander, now lying motionless beneath her bloody paws. For A few moments the crowd seized up with horror. Then, when it began to sink in that Verlisden could no longer inflict terror on the inhabitants of Parison, they all expelled bated breath and shifted their attention to Glista, whose shock had given way to severe pain. She had crumpled to the ground. One of the girls Glista had trained rushed forward and laid the Stonerender's sweating head on her lap. "Kaleb, what should we do?" cried the girl. Kaleb found Grimwit in the crowd. "Grimwit, how fast can you get her to Terrashine?" "In less than an hour," said the bear. "Then 2 or 3 of you men get her up. Gently now. Onto Grimwit's back. Teva, follow him. Find Fallwrinkle and bring him to Glista as quickly as you can. Leek," Kaleb added, looking up at the dragon, "you won't mind giving an old friend a ride one more time, will you?" The dragon extended its broad wings and bent low to the ground, allowing Kaleb to mount his back again. Before the dragon took off, Kaleb turned to the crowd of men and animals assembled there. "I am very proud of you all," he said. "Firstly, for your courage, but more than that, because you found a way to confront a great enemy through an alliance that was broken for centuries. Your trust in each other has saved Parison from a terrible evil. Don't ever forget that." By now Grimwit and Teva had bounded off into the woods, with Glista draped over the bear's broad back. After a few brief instructions to the Dellbloods regarding how they should handle the prisoners from Ablerin, take their weapons and release them back to their people with a stern warning not to attempt violence on Glenward ever again, Kaleb wrapped his tired arms around the dragon's neck. "Now, Leek," he shouted into the dragon's ears. In a sudden flurry of motion, the dragon shot up from the ground. Within moments, the dragon and its rider had vanished from the sight of those still standing in the meadow.